All right, good evening. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Kathleen Britton. I'm on the Storm Surge Board, and it's my delight to welcome you this evening. And our speaker tonight, Katie Giannakopoulos, is going to talk about high stakes at high tide, understanding the coastal flood risks. I think I'm doing this. For those of you who are new to Storm Surge, we were founded in 2013 as the threat to our coastline from sea level rise was starting to become a recurring problem in our community. So to address the coastal issues of climate change, we promote science-based outreach and education, including creating some original content in video format for use by schools. Here we are. Here's Katie, and she's going to be joining us in just a moment. Katie is with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and she is going to walk us through how science and community action can transform vulnerability into strength. We'll learn more about forces that are driving coastal change and the difficult lessons learned from the January 2024 storm events. Katie is going to deliver our call to action this evening by sharing science-based approaches to improving community preparedness, as well as practical strategies for building long-term coastal resilience. We are here this evening with great thanks to the City of Newburyport that provides us this space for our meetings, and of course for the Hub, which films our speaker series, and then we eventually get it posted on our website as well. It should go without saying, but we want to say a special thanks to all of you for supporting us. We wouldn't be here without you. We exist because of people like you who share our mission to empower our community. And we thank you very much for your financial support and for your activism. Now, we're busy working on our 2025-2026 speaker series, and we're going to be announcing at least the fall portion of that series in the weeks ahead. If you aren't on our email mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet on the refreshment table. Now, there's one thing. If you had attended an earlier program this year that was hosted by the Mass Oyster Project, we have a little update for you from that. And my fellow board member, Mike, is going to come up and share a few words.
Thank you. I'm not going to steal much of your time.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, right. Hey, everybody. Good evening. So if you were here sometime this winter, you heard from Lee Wright, who is the director of the Mass Oyster Project. The purpose of the Mass Oyster Project is to bring oysters back, not as a commercial resource, but as an ecological resource. They have the ability to filter water and clean the water. They have the ability to also build reefs and create bottom stability against coastal surge. And ultimately, ideally, it brings back an agriculture resource that is sorely lost. I mean, the estimate is that over 80% of the traditional oyster population worldwide is gone. So now's the time. What does that mean for us here in Newburyport? One of the elements of Mass Oyster Project is upwellers. An upweller is a large box with complicated plumbing, ultimately that goes into the river to draw water so that we can cultivate spat or baby oysters. And over the course of the summer, this upweller will be running. It's next to the harbor master's office on the dock. It'll be running probably late next week. It's an education resource, of course, because people can come in and see what does a baby oyster look like and to hear the story about why are they here and what are we doing with them. But ultimately, it's the foundation for the ability to grow a larger oyster population in and around Newburyport. That's the ultimate goal. So again, come down by the harbor master's office this summer, check it out. If you'd like to volunteer, it's a nominal 1-hour effort each week flexible in terms of scheduling, fun, easy, a little messy, but that's good mess. And if you're interested in volunteering, either grab me this evening or go online to massoysters.org and you'll see a volunteer page. So thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so now let's get to the good part and welcome Katie. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Katie Janikopoulos. I'm a Coastal Dynamics Research Associate at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And I'm super excited to be here with you all today to talk about coastal flooding and coastal storms. I'm going to start by introducing myself a little bit more. So I'm originally from southern New Hampshire, so not too far from here, only a little over an hour. I grew up loving meteorology. Ever since I was like 6 years old, I always told people I was going to be a meteorologist. When everyone wanted to be doctors or firefighters, I was like, no, I'm going to be a meteorologist. And that was something that kept with me through my education. When it was time to decide what to study in college, I knew that meteorology was it. So what I didn't know is that it was going to bring me halfway across the country. So I attended the University of Oklahoma, where I received my bachelor's in meteorology and loved it so much that I stayed an extra 2 years to get my master's. While I was there, I worked in the Applied Climate Dynamics lab, meaning I looked at a lot of like large-scale climate patterns and how that actually influences the local climate. And I examined temperature whiplash in the southern plains, which essentially means that periods where we go from extremely hot to extremely cold in a really quick period of time. That's what I studied. So there in the top is a picture of me and my friend when we went storm chasing out in Oklahoma. We didn't see a tornado, but we saw some pretty cool clouds. But that's what it was like going to school in Oklahoma. All tornadoes all the time. But after school, after growing up in New England, I knew I wanted to make my way back here. And so I joined GMRI last summer and changed my fieldwork experience from storm chasing to working in the mudflats. So that's a picture from last summer with some mudflat fieldwork that we did, which was a completely new thing to me, but was a very fun experience. Yeah, so that's me. And I'll introduce the Gulf of Maine Research Institute a little bit since we are not located in this state. We are an independent, nonpartisan marine nonprofit that supports the Gulf of Maine ecosystem and the communities that depend on it. So really what we focus on is taking research that's being done within and beyond our organization and making sure that it's going directly back into the community. We do a lot of presentations like this. We go into classrooms. We work with a lot of external partners, whether that's at universities or whether that's working with city planners to talk about climate impacts. So we really want to bridge that gap between research and the community. And we're located in Portland, Maine. That's our building right there on Commercial Street. If you've been up to Portland, you know Commercial Street's a pretty fun place to be. We're also right on the water, which is super nice, especially in the summer now. So but while we're located in Portland, Maine, we serve communities across the entire Gulf of Maine. So the Gulf of Maine spans all the way from the bottom of Georges Bank, all the way up into the Bay of Fundy. So while we're located in Portland and we're here today in Newburyport, we are all still part of the Gulf of Maine community, and that is all within the realm that we study at GMRI. Our mission is to develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. So we kind of do this through with like a climate change thread throughout all of these. So basically, we want to ensure that for first, fisheries and the seafood industry can adapt to a changing climate, especially since in Portland we really are heavily reliant on our working waterfront. So that's really important for us. We also want to build climate-ready communities, meaning that we want to make sure that communities are prepared. We do climate vulnerability assessments through GMRI, so communities know what climate risks that they're facing. We also work to develop the blue economy and support our working waterfront workers. Portland is still very much a working port city, and so we really want to make sure that that's something that sustains in a changing climate. And then we also support energy solutions, working on things like grid resilience and offshore wind. The specific lab that I work in is the Coastal Dynamics Lab, run by Hannah Baranis, up in the top left corner. But we have a lot of broad goals within our lab. First, we work to understand drivers of mean and extreme coastal and estuarine water levels. And so that, for me, means looking at coastal storms and how that impacts coastal water level, which is what I'll be talking about a lot today. Also study the evolution of coastal ecosystems, which again goes kind of towards our mudflat work that we're doing to see how mudflats are expected to change with climate change, whether they can be resilient in change or whether that's something that we really need to focus attention on. And then last, we develop solutions to support coastal adaptation. So that's really where we work with communities to help make sure that they're prepared for climate change. We install tide gauges across the coast to get more tide measurements. The photo in the bottom left is my boss hanging off a bridge, installing a tide gauge. So we do a lot of work like that. But yeah, we do a bunch within our lab, but today I'm going to be talking specifically about coastal storms and sea level rise. So going into that, the objectives that we'll be covering today are what are the physical drivers of extreme coastal water level? And then once we know that, we can start talking about sea level rise, what's causing it, and what we don't know about sea level rise yet. And then, kind of as a theme throughout, trying to figure out how all of these factors contributed to the January 2024 storms. Okay, so now let's start getting into some science. So, why do we care about water? Well, we care about water because it can have prolific impacts in our community. So what we have up in the top right here is a water level chart. And so there are multiple lines on the chart, and we'll go through them all. So the blue line is the predicted water level, meaning that's the water level that we see based on the tides, and that we can predict pretty well. And so that's why we call it predicted water level. However, the green is what we actually observe. And so this series here is of January 2024. And so as you can see, the green line and the blue line are not the same. And when that happens, that means pretty big consequences for the community, which is all these photos here, which were passed on to me by the storm surge organizers. So these are all of your community. And so definitely can see how you guys are impacted by these storms. And then the purple line up at on the graph is the difference between the blue and the green line. So the peaks that you see in those are going to be related to your storm surge. And so we care about water because it can, when it's not what we predict it to be, these are the kind of impacts we can see, and we need to be prepared to handle those types of events. All right, so now we'll start going into our first objective with what goes into a water level. And so I'm going to introduce these first, and then I'll go into talking about each of them specifically. So first, we have tides. Tides are really important to coastal flooding because they're kind of the modulator of flooding. So if we have a 3-foot, 5-foot storm surge, but the tide is low, it's not going to have that much of an impact on the community. However, if we have a high tide that occurs at the same time of a 5-foot storm surge, that's where we start getting problems. And so the tides are going to be really important when we start talking about flooding. Then we have interannual variability, meaning your year-to-year water level, which can vary about plus or minus 1 foot. But then this is also where we can start to introduce sea level rise, which can be anywhere from 1.5 to 6 feet by 2100. So we'll go into that as well. Then we have storm surge, which at the most extreme in New England can be around 3 to 5 feet. And then we have freshwater influence, which is very highly variable, and that's going to be any sort of freshwater that can play into coastal water level, which for you guys is very important because you're on the Merrimack River. And so that can definitely play into a lot of the flooding that you guys see here in Newburyport. And then lastly, which is not quite as relevant for inland Newburyport, but if you're seaward of Plum Island, you also have wave effects. All right, so let's start talking about tides. So why do we care about tides? Well, as I said, they're the modulator of water level of coastal flooding. But also, the Gulf of Maine, specifically the Bay of Fundy, has the largest tides in the world. And that makes it a pretty cool place to be. I had the opportunity to go up to the Bay of Fundy and got to see the tidal change, and it was wild. So if you have the chance to go, absolutely go, because it's so worth it. But yeah, that makes it a really cool thing to study here because we have the largest tides in the world. So how are tides created? Tides are created by this beautiful graphic here by NASA. So essentially, the force between the moon and the earth causes tides. And so, also the sun, but we won't go too far into that. So essentially, there's a force between the earth and the moon. It's called the centrifugal force. And essentially what it does is it holds us together while we rotate. So if you think of spinning around, grabbing hands with someone and spinning around, you're not going to let go, because if you let go, you're going to go flying. And that's essentially the same type of force that we see here between the Earth and the moon. And so when it pulls, the force pulls, it causes the water to bulge as well. So we see a high tide and a low tide as a result of that. The high tides are what we call the lunar bulge. And we spin through those every 12.4 hours. So we experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. And so we know tides, but why do we have the largest tides in the Gulf of Maine? To think about that, we can think of the Gulf of Maine like a bathtub. So when we have that force that exerts on the water, essentially, if you push someone on a swing and you push them, even if you stop pushing them, they're still going to swing for a little while. And that's essentially what happens in the Gulf of Maine with the water. So the water continues to slosh back and forth. And because of the bathymetry, what's the bottom of the ocean, we slosh at about 13 hours. And so when we kind of like put those together, they cause a bigger tide because they happen around the same time. So that's why we have the biggest tides. All right, that's tides. Now we'll talk about interannual variability and sea level rise. So this here is a graph of the annual mean sea level from the 1900s to the present. This is at the Boston Tide Gauge, which is located there. And so what we can see is that since the time of the record, we've experienced a positive trend. The line is going generally up. And so that has been about 1.1 feet since the early 1900s. However, within that line, you can see that there's these variations up and down year to year. And that's what we call our interannual variability. And that can be pretty different depending on the year. So for example, in 2023 and 2024, we had a 3-inch abrupt rise in sea level that has since come down in 2025, which is good news. But there's a lot of factors that can go into interannual sea level, and that is something that's very much still an active area of research, but I'll touch on why scientists think that happened a bit later in the talk. So we see these numbers. We see 3 inches and like 1 foot. What does that really mean? It's been since the 1900s. Well, it means a big difference in terms of flooding. So this is a bell curve. If you've never seen one before, in science, we call it a normal distribution. And essentially, this can really describe a multitude of things. So if we think of human height, for example, most people are going to be in the middle. They're going to be like an average height, right? So that's going to be your big part of your curve. However, you also have people that are taller and shorter. And so that goes into like the extremes. So if you have people walking through a doorway, generally most people aren't going to hit their head. However, if we slightly switch this distribution, if you give people 6-inch stilts and say walk through a door, more people are gonna hit their head now. And that is pretty much what this is showing. So the same thing can be said for high water level. So if this is a graph of high tide, now, while there weren't a lot of days that were above this flood risk, if we have sea level rise, even slightly, we now expose many more days to having a flood risk. So that's what it looks like with a bell curve with actual numbers. This is how we talk about flooding in Portland. So in Portland, we expect to have 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100 based on the 2000 sea level. So if this here is the distribution for the 2000 sea level, that's our high water. If we shift that 1.5 feet by 2050, we go from having flooding a few times a year to 1 of 4 days, which is pretty significant, especially considering now in Portland, on our high tide days, if we have extremely high tides, we're already flooding. So that's pretty bad. However, if we increase to 4 feet, we're now seeing minor flooding daily in Portland. So that's a pretty significant change. So while these numbers don't always sound big, they mean a big difference. Okay, so now we know sea level rise seems like a problem. What's going into causing that problem? Well, there's a few different things that are happening. So first, we're having melting ice, and then 2, we're having warming waters. So the graph here on the right shows the individual contributions to sea level rise. So in the blue, we have mountain glaciers, which essentially are big glaciers of ice that are melting because of global warming. And we can kind of tie those in with Greenland and Antarctica, which are both ice sheets. And those are all melting. And while the Greenland and Antarctica percentages are pretty low right now, these are massive sheets of ice that at some point are going to hit a point where they're just going to accelerate melting. And then those values are going to go way up. So they don't look big now, but they are big in the future. So we have first melting ice. Then we have thermal expansion, which essentially means when you warm something, it's going to expand. So as the ocean is warming, the sea level's rising. And you can think of that like a hot air balloon. If you fill up a hot air balloon, it's going to expand. Same kind of principle. The molecules, when you heat them up, get excited and start taking up more space, and it causes rising. So warming waters, melting ice. Those are our 2 big sea level rise causes. What's actually acting to lower the sea level, while minimally, is land water storage. So that's going to be anything that's really taking water and putting it on the land. So whether that's like a big storm that comes through and it's warm outside and it takes water from the ocean and rains it down on the land, that's one way you can have land water storage. Whether that's anything that just takes water out of the ocean, really. If you block off water for any purpose, that's going to contribute to land water storage. Okay, so now if we take this, we've looked at historically what's going on, but what does it look like in the future? So we take this chart here on the right and we shrink it down really small to down here. We can talk about how we're expecting to change in the future. So there's a lot to talk about on this slide. So essentially, there are a lot of different scenarios that could potentially change what our future climate looks like. And first is the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere, because that is going to be driving where we are pretty much like up or down here. It's going to have an acceleration because of our next piece we're going to talk about, but generally we're going to see an increase because of carbon. And we don't really know what the future of carbon looks like. There's a couple different scenarios that we discuss when we talk about climate change. So first, we talk about, okay, what happens? We got the low scenario. If we have, if we like put intense climate carbon reducing policies in place, then that would like lower the projection. We're already kind of past that point where that scenario really makes sense, because we've already put too much carbon into the atmosphere. So really, we only talk about the intermediate, which is the blue shading here, and the pink shading, which is the high scenario. The intermediate scenario essentially means that we take, that we have measures to reduce carbon, but we also still kind of emit. And so that's kind of more of where we're sort of at now with that level of policy. And then the high scenario is we kind of get rid of all of our carbon reducing measures and keep emitting. And so hopefully we don't get to the high scenario. But depending on like city planning, they can use a variety of these scenarios. And so that's kind of like the difference between the blue and the pink. However, even within one of those, we look just at the blue, there's still a large amount of questions of where we're gonna see sea level rise just within that scenario. And so that's because of the uncertainty of melting of Greenland and Antarctica. Essentially, we know that at some point we're going to, these ice sheets are gonna melt to the point where it's like a point of no return, that these are going to just kind of almost like crumble under their own weight because they're melting so much. And essentially like Greenland, as it melts, it's really high actually, so when it melts, it gets lower, it gets into warmer air, so that also causes it to melt faster. So those kind of factors make us unsure of where we're gonna see sea level rise. And so because of that, we don't really know where we're gonna fall, but we know that with that carbon scenario, it would be somewhere in there. The only way to really like study this is to go to these places and take measurements and things. So that's one reason we have to like keep funding science because we need people to learn about these things. They're very complex dynamics, and so yeah, quick little plug for science. But that's sea level rise. Essentially, we'll be somewhere in there. But the thing to really take away is that right now, we've only had about 1 foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. But when we look at the scenarios, we're moving up to like double digits feet of sea level rise. So that's pretty significant and can have really big consequences. So it's important to consider sea level rise. Okay. Going back to our chart, next we'll talk about storm surge and freshwater influence. So when we talk about storms, it's important to talk about what storms we're talking about. So we have 2 types of storms generally. We have tropical cyclones and extratropical cyclones. And so tropical cyclones are going to be your hurricanes, your typhoons if you're in the Pacific, and those generally originate in the tropics. They originate in the tropics because of changes in easterly winds, as well as waves that come off of Africa. And those, because they're over such warm water, those disturbances can cause these tropical cyclones. And they really feed off of warm water. So that's what we call them warm core storms, because the center of them are really warm. If you're like in the eye of a hurricane, it's gonna be warm. These storms generally are going to be more symmetrical, and they're going to be smaller than extratropical cyclones are. Your really big ones can be pretty large, but generally they're smaller. And it's hard to kind of tell in the photos, but when you see like a hurricane over the water where there's no like influence from land, they are pretty like circular. They're like very, very cool, beautiful satellite imagery. But yeah, they also have no fronts. So when you hear the weatherman talk about a cold front and a warm front, they don't have any fronts like that because they're symmetrical. And then on the flip side, what we're more used to up here is extratropical cyclones, meaning that they originate in the mid-latitudes. This can be like somewhere like the Great Plains, and they are driven by differences in temperature. So being in the US, we have cold Arctic air that comes in from the north, and we have warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico that kind of meets in the middle of the US. And these differences in temperature can cause these disturbances. And so these, because they're more like, the center of these is going to be cold and they're more like temperature driven, we call them cold core storms. They're not driven by warm water at all. These do have fronts, so these are going to be, you have a cold front come through, it's going to be related to these kinds of storms. When we talk specifically about coastal flooding, we have, depending on where you are, you have different storm drivers. So generally kind of south of New York, you're going to be getting both tropical and extratropical cyclone influences from flooding. The top surge event in New York is Hurricane Sandy, and if you look at the water levels, it's like this huge outlier in water level, which is pretty scary when you're not expecting something like that. So when you are in a region that has tropical cyclones, the water level can vary a lot more than when you have just extratropical cyclones. Especially in the Gulf of Maine, where we see primarily extratropical cyclones, there's really only one pathway of water into and out of the Gulf of Maine. So we kind of generally, while we are not expecting some surge, like we generally know the range of surge values we can expect to see because of these storms. We're not getting like a crazy 10-foot storm surge like you can get from tropical cyclones. Okay, so that's a little primer on storm surge. And then freshwater, again, it's very important for your community, but that's gonna be anything like blocked storm drain outfalls, warm, rainy winter storms, and for you guys, river flooding. So you guys are kind of in an unfortunate place because you have flooding. You get river flooding and you also get coastal flooding. So that I can imagine is pretty bad. I had a little bit of information on the January storms and I heard it impacted your water supply and things. And so I'd love to hear more about that in the Q&A as well. Yeah, so river flooding, very important for your community. So this is gonna be a pretty big source. Okay, so those four things, tides, interannual variability and sea level rise, storm surge, and freshwater influence, are all what we call an inundation or still water level, meaning the water level is literally going up and down. Like we're not talking about waves, we're just talking about water that's just still going up and down. When you have wave effects, that means kind of a different type of impact based on inundation and still water level. So here, I have some pictures of inundation flooding versus inundation when you have waves. So these are all in Portland. On the left, we have just inundation. You can see that there's things, they become problems because you have flooded roads, which obviously would probably need to close. And then like up in the top one, that like white thing on the wall there, that's a heat pump. So that's probably not something you want to be exposed to water. But generally, you're gonna have impacts, but they're not gonna be like damaging, destructive, like terrible impacts. When you have inundation plus waves, that's where you're seeing more of your like hard hit infrastructure damages. And so up in the top, we have a dock that got pretty destroyed. And then in the bottom, you literally see the wave crashing and broken road. So that can be a really big problem. So waves kind of amplify the problem once you have inundation flooding. Okay. Freshwater influence and wave effects are going to be really hard to account for when you start talking about water level because of the fact that they are going to vary depending on really wherever you are on the coast. And so if you're trying to get an idea of these things, they require like detailed coastal modeling, and they're all going to be represented differently in your forecast, in like your water level. So yeah, kind of like beyond the work we do, but yeah. Okay, now going back to our big objectives, we've pretty much covered the first two big ones. We know what the physical drivers of extreme coastal water level are now, and we know about sea level rise and what's causing it, and what we don't know, specifically related to a lot of ice sheets. But how did all of these factors contribute to the January 2024 storms? That's what we're gonna chat about next. So when I talk about what the January 2024 storms are, it's probably important for me to tell you what they are in case you weren't here in January 2024. I was not here in January 2024, so I've done a lot of learning about these ones. So essentially these were two storms that occurred in January 2024 on the 10th and the 13th, and they both caused extreme coastal water level impacts. So again, we have that same chart that I showed earlier on the right, where again, the blue is the tides, The green is what we actually saw, and the purple is going to be the difference between those. As a note too, the purple is generally always going to be higher than 0 because of the fact that tide predictions are actually based on water level from the 1990s. And as we've learned in this talk, the sea level's risen since the 1990s. So generally that number is going to always be greater than 1, but those big peaks are where we see surge. So when we talk about water level, on January 10th, the water level prediction based on the tides was 10.5 feet. However, what was actually seen in Boston was 14 feet. So that's about a 3.5 foot difference between what was expected versus what we actually saw. Then that's pretty crazy, one event, but then we have the same thing happen 3 days later. So then on the 13th, we expected the water level to be 11.2 feet. What we actually saw was 14.4. So again, another over 3 foot difference, which was pretty significant. And so these, more photos from Newburyport. These are some more photos of flooding. As you can see, these are more inundation flooding. These are gonna be you're not seeing many waves, but the still water level is pretty high. And it meant a lot of impacts to infrastructure, to roadways, as you can see by the flooded cars there. So it was pretty prolific for your community. It was also the same way up in Maine. We had really bad impacts as well. I think it destroyed 70% of Maine's working waterfront and caused over $90 million in public infrastructure damage alone, not including private docks or anything. So pretty significant across the Gulf of Maine. So we see that these are pretty crazy, but why did they happen? And we now can learn about why they happened because of everything we've talked about already. So first was the timing in which these storms occurred. So here we have a monthly tide chart. So we have you can see that there's periods where we have higher tides than normal. And again, that's going to be based on just where the sun, the moon, and the earth are. And so when these storms occurred, we were right there in the highest part of the tides. So these storms occurred at a time of high tides. And so if we add the storm surge on top of that, you can see the big purple streaks. That is pretty bad to happen on top of already high tides. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 was that the annual mean sea level was high. So again, if we go back to our interannual variability, the 2023-2024 sea level was the highest it's ever been. And the large reason why that happened was climate change, in the sense that we've been seeing this increase in sea level. So when you have these interannual changes, they're happening at a higher baseline. So definitely driven by climate change. In terms of the big peak, there's a lot of research still going on as to why that happened. But generally, the reason for why they think that happened is because of the relationship between ocean currents and weather patterns. So essentially, new research is showing that certain weather patterns and pressure differences between the Arctic and the tropics can actually change this thing called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which essentially is this big conveyor belt of ocean currents in the Atlantic. And so because of this, it can actually cause the current on the bottom of the ocean, which is called the the bottom water current or something similar to that. It can cause that, which is usually really cold, to become warm. And then when that happens, you warm that whole column, and then it can lead to increases in sea level rise. And so that's why they think the sea level was this high. But again, keep your eyes on science, because more stuff will probably come out about that since it was so prolific. So that's problem 2. The annual mean sea level was really high. And then 3, we have wind direction. So when we talk about storms in New England, I'm sure you all have probably heard of nor'easters, which generally mean, when they talk about nor'easters, they're referring to storms that cause winds from the northeast over the coastal region. So if we look in this purple box there, the wind direction over Maine, which are the arrows, show that they're coming from the northeast. And again, you guys are pretty vulnerable to these because of your location along the coast. So to get a strong storm surge or to get strong or large waves, you need three things. You need wind that's blowing over a long area for a long time at a high wind speed. And so you guys have kind of a distance to blow over the Gulf of Maine before the winds get to you. So I'm sure, I do know the Boston records for these are all from nor'easters. All your water level, your top three water levels are all going to be from these nor'easters. But specifically in Maine, especially, we're pretty vulnerable for storms that have winds from the southeast, which we term sou'easters. It's not an official term, we just call it that. And so essentially, like I said, you need a long area of wind blowing for a long time at a high speed. And so when you have winds from the southeast, you essentially have no land in between Maine and Brazil. And so the wind has nothing to block it. Whereas when you have a nor'easter, the winds can't blow that far over water without hitting land. So especially for the Maine coast, this was pretty prolific because of the fact that we had winds that were blowing very intensely over the coast. And so both January storms were actually these sou'easters. You guys are actually vulnerable to both, so that's kind of stinks. But so in Maine, we're a little less vulnerable to nor'easters, but you guys have both. So these kind of cause a different type of water impact, whereas where infrastructure and things are generally prepared to handle nor'easters, but they're not really prepared to handle these sorts of sou'easter events. And so that's why the wind direction from both of these storms was a problem. So that's our third problem. The wind direction was not favorable. And so if we talk overall, what caused the extreme storm tides, meaning the water level plus the surge, in January, we had southeasterly winds that drove a large storm surge. We had monthly high tides. We had sea level rise and variability, and we had climate change. And so all of those came together to become the prolific events that were January 2024. And these water level ranks at the tide gauge, I think they're actually flipped, but they ranked 7th and 4th at the Boston tide gauge since they started recording. So yeah, while it was not a nor'easter, they were still pretty impactful in Massachusetts. So with this, I want to plug some current work at GMRI because we're doing a lot of work learning about sou'easters. There was a lot of questions from the community, kind of like, what are these storms? We've seen, and we also had, I didn't include this, but we had a sou'easter that December before as well. So there were 3 sou'easters in 2 months, which was pretty wild. And so the community really wanted to know, are we expecting to see more of these? Is this a climate change problem? We don't think it's happening and increasing, so little preview, but essentially what we're doing is we're looking back in history and creating a catalog of all the sou'easters that we've seen from 1950 to present. And then we want to answer a lot of questions about how they compare to nor'easters. So specifically, what are the atmospheric patterns that are different that are causing these sou'easters? How does storm surge change with these wind directions? We have an idea of what we think is happening, but do we actually see that in the numbers? And then also, how can communities prepare for both impacts of nor'easters and sou'easters? Because we want communities to be prepared for whatever comes at them. So that's what we're doing at GMRI, but you are all here because you're engaged in science. And so I wanted to, for my call to action, I wanted to talk about what you guys can do in your own community to be involved in helping with sea level rise and coastal storms. And so first of all, I want to say you're already playing a big role by being here and being a part of this organization. This is an incredible group. And you guys have done awesome work, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I'm sure you know because you were part of the organization. But the fact that you're engaging with science readily is awesome. And that's something, science changes so fast that it's so important to be engaged and really keep up with what's going on. And yeah, so you guys are doing great already. So keep engaging with science, keep doing what you're doing is my first one. But what you can actually do beyond that, I think you should get involved in community science projects. And that's something we talk about a lot at GMRI because we have a similar one that I'll kind of preview a little bit as well. But the Cashman Park project is so awesome. I went through it on your website. It's so great to put some sort of levels and locations to where these things may happen, because that's how you're going to get the message to people that this matters. When you see that, oh, well, by 2050, like a place that I really like to go is going to be pretty flooded. Like that's, you want to know those things, and that's where you're really going to get people to understand the impacts. And so this is great, putting the levels of the high tides with sea level rise, that's great. I love that, so keep doing things like that. And I also, you probably know about this because you guys had a lot of entries on My Coast, but My Coast is a place that you can upload pictures of flooding, and we have a very similar one that we do for Maine at GMRI. And this is so great because you can't have a tide gauge at every single location up the coast. But we have a tide gauge in Boston, but what does that mean for Newburyport? And so when you can take pictures of flooding and actually associate what that looks like to a water level, that's so important. And I don't know specifically about My Coast, but at least with when we do in Maine, like we feed that data directly to the National Weather Service. So they're incorporating that into their predictions and like the messages they're communicating because of the community. And climate change is going to be something that is not just, scientists can't do it ourselves. Like this is something that's going to take the entire community, and you guys are already on a great path to doing that. So with that, thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah?
In one of your slides, you showed a chart of the tides and how during the January storms they were unusually high.
Yes.
These are predictable.
Yes.
We can write out tide charts going into the future.
Yep.
Is anyone publicizing months in advance when those high tides will be, so that if there is some preparation you do for your property, you can at least get a jump on that?
Yes, so NOAA actually produces all of the tides for the whole year on their website. Whether that's making it to you guys, I don't specifically know. It's on their website. I know if you go on the Boston tide gauge page, it'll show you the tidal predictions, and that will have the list of tides. I know at GMRI we really try to get that out there for communities because we know that that's an area that's not happening really. And so short answer is yes, they're available. Whether they're getting beyond that website page, I'm not sure, but they're definitely out there.
Kate,
Yeah.
when people ask you a question, you're going to have to repeat it because you have
Yes.
the mic for the TV. They
Yeah.
don't hear.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the northeasters and southeasters, have you determined whether the wind speed is greater now than it used to be? I mean, it seems to me that it's windier.
Yeah, we've looked. Oh yes. The question was whether the wind speed is greater or not now for these storms. What we've found is we haven't specifically found that in our sou'easters. We haven't really looked into the nor'easters yet. That's kind of the next piece of our project is comparing the two. For sou'easters, we don't really see any sorts of trends in wind speed. but that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. But we haven't seen that looking back, any sort of statistical increase. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for your talk and for your good work.
Yeah, thank you.
Question about the storm rises that we had in January 2024. When there was a storm system coming up, was there also a low pressure system associated with that caused sea level rise as well, like locally?
Yes. So the question is whether there was also a low pressure system that was associated with this storm. And the answer is yes. So these extratropicals are always going to have some sort of low associated with them. And generally, these lows can cause a slight increase in sea level. We call it the inverse barometer effect, which essentially means there's a lower pressure, so the sea level rises a little bit. It's very incremental. It's like less than an inch. Like it's pretty small. But that is a factor into that does happen with storms. Of course. Yeah.
Could you talk about the Cashman Park project? And I don't know if you're involved or who is involved.
Yes, I'm not involved. I don't know if you'd like to talk about it. You probably can explain it way better than me.
Yes, so that was something we did after that January 14th storm, this spring in Earth Week. It was called Rising Tides. The idea was to visualize the impact of future sea level rise levels. And there is a great description on the Storm Surge website with a lot of pictures and background information on it. But basically, we got permission from the state to put high tide markers for the future for 2030, 2050, 2070 was as far as we went. On the boat launch, so that they stayed up all summer to show where normal tides would be projected to be in those future decades. But then what ended up being a little bit even more interesting was with the help of the Woods Hole group, they created that map that Katie showed, which had the inundation lines. So that showed, layered on top of the Cashman Park map, where the daily tides would come into, and the red was 2030, the orange was 2050, and the yellow was 2070. And interestingly, we had a bunch of photos from that January storm, and you could see it from the inundation levels that had happened in the park in January, that they were at least up to 2050, if not close to 2070. And given what you were saying about the high tides, that makes sense, because the future projections, it was definitely closer to the 2070 level than it was even 2050. We got some drone video of people standing on that line, and a group from Salem State University made a nice video of the park in that on that day. And so one of the things that it caused a lot of people to have conversations, which was the intent, at the park that day, and then subsequently at different events in the city afterwards. And so the city's resiliency committee has applied for a grant this year from the state. We'll hear whether we get it in June, to study Cashman Park and what can be done as sort of a multi-decade plan in terms of future flood protection there. So if we get that, and it should be announced any time now, you'll hear about that. But that at least in part came because of the discussions that happened from people raising issues based on the Cashman Park project. So we feel pretty good about that.
Yeah.
Would you just share with us what led to your being such an enthusiastic expert in this particular area?
Sure, of course. So I've always, the question is why I am so enthusiastic about this topic. And and an expert in this. So the reason I've been interested in water level is because I've been interested in storms and hurricanes specifically. I know we don't get them up here often, but since I was a child. So I read a book about hurricanes when I was 6 years old, and that's what really sparked my interest in the weather. And so even though I went to Oklahoma and studied tornadoes for a little bit, my heart has always belonged to the impacts to like the coastal environment. And so, yeah, and I think it's a really important topic that people don't always realize is as important as it is. And like I think the fact that like Miami could be like very much underwater is pretty significant. And while people know that, it's going to have really big impacts, and that has a lot of impacts to infrastructure. Like, what do you do with all of these buildings that are going to be like very much underwater? Like, those are big impacts that I don't think people think about as often as they should. And so I'm very enthusiastic about that. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I really appreciate you bringing this up, especially that thought experiment you just came up with. So what do you find is the best way of getting people to wrap their heads around something they just don't want to see?
The question is, how do I get people to wrap their heads around something that they don't want to see? That's a great question, and that's something we deal with a lot at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. We have a team, they're called the Community Climate Action Team, and their job is specifically to like take climate change information into the community. And we run into that a lot of like, this is pretty scary stuff. And, people can be very hesitant to learn about it, and just because it's scary and they don't want to think about it. What we try to do is we try to frame everything with an air of hope as well, and the fact that people are engaging with this science, and there's a lot of work being done. And I think what's cool is if we think of like how far technology's come in the last like 50 years, like, by the time we reach 2100 and 2150, like, you have no idea what's even going to be out there to like help solve these problems. And when everyone is so engaged, or most of the people we would work with, I'd say, are pretty engaged in this work, and are pretty, because we're seeing the impacts directly in Portland. I think people can't really ignore it because it's already there. Like, on high tide flooding days, we flood already. So like those peak water levels that you saw, the tides, like, we take people out to like go see those, because it's already like, we can't go on one of our wharves because it's underwater just from high tides. And so I think trying to keep some sort of hope in there, and not just being like, well, things are bad. Like, you always have to frame it with some sort of hope as well. And the fact that people are engaging in this work can help us do that for sure. Yeah.
Is Portland doing something at the moment to structurally kind of move the structures?
Yeah, the question is Portland doing anything right now to like move structures, or what they're really doing to combat this? And the answer is yes. Maine is very climate forward, which has been like very exciting. Like, all the coastal communities, because we see the impacts, they're pretty willing to like invest in climate adaptation. In terms of like moving buildings, I don't think they've really moved buildings. I know we've lifted roads. We have a lot of roads. We have Scarborough Marsh, which has like a very low-lying road in it. And so like we've done a lot of like raising those. A lot of our vulnerability assessments go into basically what needs to be done in the community to make sure we're prepared for those kinds of things. So we do a lot of that. We have these, what we call commit to manage numbers in Portland. So essentially, that's our 1.5 feet by 2050, and then 4 feet by 2100. And so essentially, if anything new is being built in Maine, they have to comply with those numbers. So they have to plan for those levels of sea level rise when they build. So Portland's very hesitant to like give out a lot of like waterfront building permits, and you have to have like a very good plan. And if you don't have a good plan, you'll hear about it from the community. So I think that kind of also is a component that they don't want to. We've had a lot of like big developments stopped and things because the community is so against it. So yeah, Portland's doing a lot. Yeah.
This involves both of you, but
Mhm.
just to follow up on that question.
Yeah.
Is Newburyport making plans? What are the things that are coming up fairly quickly? And are we being successful in getting people involved to do things that are demonstrations or help?
Newburyport has a vulnerability assessment. It was done in 2020, so it's at the point where it needs to be updated for 2025. Some of the vulnerabilities that were identified in that plan included the wastewater treatment plant, and there was an initiative to build the big revetment in front, raise that up, put the bike path on top, was a nice side effect of that. But that raises the protection in front of the wastewater treatment plant to 14 feet, which is not bad. There are still some vulnerabilities around the wastewater treatment plant that the city has not yet addressed, and that includes sidewalls, because as you mentioned, the bathtub effect, the water will come in and it will be blocked where we have the stone revetment, but it will come around the sides where the American Yacht Club is, and on the other side. So there's a plan that is being designed in the city to do those sidewalls, and that's out for public comment now. So it's in the design stage, and there's been at least one public meeting to discuss the impacts to abutters and how that project is going to go forward. You mentioned the water, the drinking water vulnerability. And January 14th was a big eye-opener for Newburyport in terms of, that was the first time we ever saw the Lower Artichoke Dam, which is the entry level to our 3-dam system from the Merrimack, get breached. The water rose up to be basically level with the water in the Lower Artichoke Dam. It didn't last too long. It was about 45 minutes at high tide. And because there was a significant amount of rainfall and water coming down from the other direction, it sort of pushed the water from the Merrimack back out. So they turned off the water supply during that period. The Department of Public Services was out there. They were monitoring the tides. They were concerned that this might be a high-risk day, so they did all the right things. But it sort of was a shot over the bow in terms of, we have a dam that is underneath the FEMA flood level at the Lower Artichoke. We have a dam that is just about at the FEMA flood levels that have just been raised at the Upper Artichoke. And the majority of our water comes from Indian Hill. So the city has a multitude of plans that are being discussed, including pipelines that come from the Indian Hill Reservoir down to the water intake. Right now, all the water gets picked up at the Lower Artichoke, the most vulnerable spot. There's also a discussion about raising the dam at the Lower Artichoke to protect that water supply. The problem with those is they're very expensive. And along with, I think, how do you address problems that people don't want to think about? The cost of these things, in my personal opinion, is something that we don't want to think about. So if you look at the 5-year capital improvement plan that's being discussed tonight at City Hall for the next 5 years, there's very little investment in those water supply resiliency projects. There's this big hockey stick effect out 5 or 6 years when they assume the funding for those projects will need to kick in. And we're not discussing that sufficiently, and it's not getting enough attention, at least my personal opinion. So there's more we can do there.
I thought it was very impressive that, when this old house came and they spent 15 minutes at least exploring the waste treatment plant in Newburyport.
Huh.
And, that was a very positive kind of reinforcement for people, I think, because it was expensive, and yet it was very necessary, and then it highlighted that way, so that it was not just local, but across the country. I thought that was pretty.
So I'm just going to repeat your comment because I don't think it's going to be picked up for the TV audience, and I probably didn't repeat your question, so I failed. But the comment was, when This Old House did an episode in Newburyport last year or the year before, they spent about 15 minutes of the show highlighting the resiliency changes that have been done at the wastewater treatment plant. So it's visible not only within our city, but outside as an example of something that has been done.
I just want to follow up on what you were saying about the discussions at City Hall. I was at City Hall before coming here, and they were talking about Andy Port's budget in the planning office, and he was getting a lot of pushback on it having a full-time position for an environmental planner. And this is what they would do. And it would be an extra $10,000 to bring a part-time to a full-time. And I just wanted to make that public and, voice your opinion, because we should have a full-time environmental planner and a conservation agent and a land use planner in Newburyport, because we have these conditions.
I vote for Ellie.
Yeah.
So we just heard a little bit about how money impacts the ability to build resiliency. Have
Yes.
you run into, as the GFRI, run into any creative, unusual, and really successful funding models that are different from what we have seen? Because I think every town is dealing with this problem of how do you convince people that it's important and necessary to protect your water supply?
Yeah, the question is if GMRI has run into this problem and if we've had any creative sources of getting money for this sort of work. Yes, we have. I know our community climate action team, they do a lot of like the setting up these sort of projects with tying in other, whether we can kind of tie in either other communities around to make it somewhat of like a little bit of a bigger project. So money is coming from like a bunch of places as opposed to like one place. That's something that I know we've done. We actually have a climate finance specialist at GMRI who creates capital stacks in order to get things funded, which she's awesome. Her name is Nikki. I'll give her a little shout out. And so she is like pretty much the driving force behind us getting funding. If you have questions about that, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk as well about climate finance. It's super fascinating. We also work with some other like nonprofits. We work with Maine Sea Grant, I know as well, to kind of get funding for a lot of like the work that we do. Yeah, I think those are the ones that come to mind specifically. Mostly like looking for more like private funding sources, I think is something that we've done in order to like help a community. But I think generally in Maine, like a lot of the public places are pretty willing, like Portland will fund like sea level rise work because they know it's important. So we've run into it, but I think we also have a pretty good public sector for funding climate in Maine.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks for coming.